All right, another episode of Duck It. Today we have a special guest, Philip, CEO and founder of Magnitt. Thank you for being here, man. Appreciate the trust.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to do it.
We've known each other for quite a little bit, a couple of years. Watched kind of Magnitt kind of grow and kind of burgeon into this super important participant and huge contributor to our ecosystem. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Interesting times. 2020 is the year nobody would have imagined.
Yeah.
We're living kind of unprecedented challenges economically. So far, what's the impact? What's the impact of the startup ecosystem around here?
So I think interestingly, there's going to be a delayed impact. So we brought out our H1 report and the numbers were all very positive. And I really had to caveat it because, as you know, to close a fundraise can be anything between 9 to 12, 14, 16
Absolutely.
months. So any of the deals that basically took place at the beginning of the year, let's say were already factored in. And what we just saw, and we're going to be publishing soon, the Q3 report, is a 50% drop in deal flow in Q3 compared to Q2. And it's the lowest quarter on record since 2018, the beginning of 2018. So again, the summers tend to be quiet, but from a pure venture investment perspective, you're beginning to see a little bit of hesitation of investments. Now, again, investment is not necessarily the best indicator. Obviously, there's revenue, growth, etc. And I think that it can be seen in different waves. And it's just the economy in general. When the pandemic hit, there was this massive struggle. And people were trying to find what's their strategy, what do they need to do. Somebody very eloquently explained it as there's effectively three groups of startups, if you want it to be harsh. One, a group that were likely to fail anyway, and the pandemic accelerated that failure because the environment was challenging. You have those who have solid businesses but flourished because they saw this increase in demand in their product, which they probably didn't anticipate. And in some of those cases, were challenged to keep up with that demand, which was a different challenge. And the third were solid businesses during good, normal times that saw a massive drop in business demand. And those are the ones that kind of needed the most support and guidance to get through this period. And I think what's basically happened over the summer is many of these guys had to, one, focus on cash being king, work out whether they have a new product that they can kind of bring out during this environment that's interesting for consumers, and effectively try and weather the storm to be in a stronger position coming out of it than they would have been going into it.
And I mean, are those assumptions, or are we tracking that? Are we tracking those three groups? Like, in terms of understanding deal flow and if things have slowed down in Q3, I mean, I kind of agree with you. I don't have the data to support it, but I kind of agree with you that I'm seeing way less deals happening. But are those drops coming from the top of the funnel in terms of new startups, or is it coming kind of midway through secondary, raises, etc.? Where are we seeing that drop?
So at the beginning of the year, we saw that there were more Series A and Series B startups as a percentage of total number than ever before. Okay. You saw this maturity in the ecosystem as companies kind of grew. And you've seen that across the market. Again, the UAE is different to Egypt. Egypt is different to Saudi Arabia. Each one's different, but you are seeing more companies grow to later stage. What we now saw in the summer is we've reverted back to the same mix, but two things had happened. One, there was a big drop in accelerator programs. So that's still part of our venture investments because they're equity exchanged investments in the company. For those that were able to pivot to virtual, they continued. For those that were traditionally offline and couldn't, you saw a massive drop. And there's a concern there for the future because that's a deal flow mechanism for future investment.
Of course,
The second is that you started to see larger deal rounds. So the average deal round at Series A and Series B is historically higher, more than 30 to 50% than they were year on year. So one of the things that we've seen is investors are making bigger bets or more established startups than making riskier investments at early stage in this current environment. And I anticipate that will continue to year end until people's appetite comes back again to invest. Now, everyone's saying the right things. They're still investing, but not necessarily as much as before.
Doesn't that go against kind of our understanding of, venture capital and investing in general? Because we know statistically that it's a numbers game, right? We know that the more VCs make, more frequency of investments, the higher the success rate. Smaller and less but bigger bets is counterintuitive to the whole idea of venture capital, right?
Yeah, but one of the things that you just have to remember is, where is the VC in their fund vintage? Like, how much capital do they actually have to deploy? Similar to a startup, if you've just raised into the pandemic, you're in the strongest position potentially possible because you're cash rich. If a VC funds have been deployed, then they don't have the capital to invest in this environment. And if it's difficult for a startup to raise right now, it's probably even harder for a VC to be raising. So yes, you're right at a high level, but again, when you go down to like the individual entities, it will really depend where they are in their cycle as to whether they can deploy it. So some have been quite active. And you've definitely seen, when you look at the mix of industries, the e-commerce, the fintech, the healthcare, the education. So industries which have seen increased demand have become more popular for investors, especially as they scale during this environment. But it'll depend on whether the VCs themselves actually have the cash to be able to deploy it.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I don't think of it that way, but I guess you're absolutely right. I guess how much they have left over, what they've raised, if they're raising, has a huge kind of impact on how they invest. Totally. There's a lot of seemingly interest from, more international VCs in the area for multiple reasons. The VC space, I think when you guys started, which I think is about 4 or 5 years ago, I'm not sure how long, but I remember a long time ago talking to you. It's changed considerably, right? I mean, back then we had probably 30, 40 VCs. Today, I don't know, we probably have 100, 150 VCs across the greater Middle East. And now we're getting increased competition internationally. And to put it lightly, and not to disrespect the VC, community out here, is that going to positively impact the caliber of our local VCs in terms of the intelligence behind the investing? Because, I'm having more and more conversations with VCs coming from different parts of the world, from the East, from the West, all around us. And just the types of conversations that we're having with them and the questions that they ask us are questions that I've never even had an answer to myself. I've never been able to answer myself.
Yep.
And so I'm starting to think, it's kind of good that we have all these VCs. And I was saying this to Eid when he was here last. I was saying, I didn't ask it in these words, but this is what I meant. I was wondering, are VCs just a simple proxy to family offices that have tons of money? And do they really add a lot of value in terms of how they invest in the region? And my argument is, maybe not as much as we'd like. I don't think the VCs in the Middle East generally, are as complex or kind of talented, and I think that's completely fair. It's not a question of their caliber or capability. It's the nature of our ecosystem and where it's at and the problems that we're solving. But now we're seeing, I spoke to a VC a couple days ago from Singapore, another one from China, and the types of questions they were asking me, I didn't have answers to.
Yep.
Are we tracking the amount of VCs that are coming into the region and the impact that that's having on how local investors are investing vis-a-vis international investors?
So for sure, we're tracking. So when we started, I think it was 2015, the first report that we published, I would say that the VC, and it's difficult, it's not VC, we call them funding institutions, because effectively you can have CVC, VC, angel groups, accelerator programs, etc. But it would have probably been in the 30, when you add them all up, the Flat Six Labs and the CVCs that were taking place. We now reach out to over 300 different funding institutions who have historically made more than one investment in a MENA-based company, including family offices and the likes, on a quarterly basis.
300.
Yeah, and it keeps growing. And I think that, number one, we have to credit the early stage investors to have actually been the first movers to build this industry. Because if it wasn't for them, this wouldn't really exist. Somebody had to give it a go. And yes, there were the 2000 startups and they received some money with some angel money and some institutional investors. It was only until 2012, 13 where there was MEVP, WAMDA, BICO and the likes started institutionalizing their money to make those investments, that this began to be created into an ecosystem. Now, what's interesting is in all emerging ecosystems, it's not completely uncommon without a track record that you begin to go into the typical large market infrastructure pain point industries that can be solved with technology. E-commerce, in my opinion, transport and logistics, but it's packaged as e-commerce, transport and logistics. Now you're seeing the fintech evolution.
Sure.
And at its core, these are relatively simple business models to kind of understand from an investment perspective and to benchmark on in terms of growth. They're not easy to implement, but like you can understand that from a mindset perspective.
Sure.
What you've begun to see is that with that number of VCs, and let's say that a large proportion is driven from Saudi Arabia, like there is a large proportion of new venture capital entities, family offices that are being built, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, that are investing in startups across the whole of the region, that are slightly newer in their psychology, that are having to find either sector, industry, or geographical focus to be able to compete. Because at this point, not everyone can do everything. Historically, these VCs used to do everything. Now they're trying to separate themselves. To the point of the international players, I think it's extremely healthy. What's more interesting is when you're beginning to see one or two GPs come to the region and join teams or set up funds. And there's countless examples of those. But I think that the success of Souk, Kareem, those big international media headline stories has definitely driven interest, predominantly, in my opinion, from Southeast Asia, who have begun to really be interested, China, Southeast Asia, in MENA, not only for MENA, but Africa, that see this as the kind of Silk Road gateway to understanding what opportunities lie. The US, I think, is so well developed, it takes a kind of certain mindset to be interested here. Europe, somewhat similar, but you are seeing Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, all beginning to see many similarities in ways that you can actually build this startup ecosystem.
How do we rank globally as a region in terms of successful exits, versus funded startups?
Low. I think one of the things recently somebody was telling me, there is a misconception that the region is flush with cash in venture capital, or in general, but in venture capital. Historically, the family offices, the institutional investors are used to traditional assets, not venture capital as an asset class. And in the absence of exits, which I think sometimes people forget, I remember it was the STEP conference where they had one of the sessions where they had the VCs and founders debating. The first time it really dawned on me, I think it was Danny and Khalid that were making the point, all you founders are finding it difficult fundraising. Remember that we as VCs have LPs who we report to and have to show success to. And therefore, in the absence of these exits, we have not seen the realized returns. Yes, there's been Kareem, fine, which has been good for certain VCs. Sure. In reality, in the absence of these success stories, we haven't really seen, say that it takes on average 10 years to 12 years to exit a company. We're getting into that sweet spot. Now, we don't know whether the pandemic delays that further. But if we see more of these success stories, then we'll see more capital being deployed. But in an absolute number, last year in the 2019 report, I believe we equated the total amount of investment in the whole of the MENA region to Finland or Spain.
Of the entire Middle East region?
The total deployed capital equated, according to other reports, to the same amount of investment that had been put into Spain, for instance. And that shows you the Southeast Asia, for instance, is multitudes, 4 or 5x of what it is that we're seeing here. And therefore, where people just assume that money is being deployed, the reality is not really the case.
Wow, super interesting. I spoke to a guy from a VC in Singapore a couple of days ago, just because it's fresh on my mind, I'm not going to name him. He's extremely interested in raising money in the region, but not investing in the region.
Yep.
Yep. And I think, to put it lightly, he said, because he thinks it's very easy to raise here because historically the VCs in the region have not been performing. And if you just go with historical data of their performance vis-a-vis the performance of local VCs who've invested here, then the competitive advantage is blatant.
Yeah.
And he was saying that a healthy exit versus funded startups is somewhere around the 5-10% if you're lucky on the high end on the 10%, whereas over here we're not even at the 1%. Are we seeing positive trends or are we seeing things unchanged?
So last year was a record year of exits. I had anticipated that this would be even higher.
Yeah.
We haven't quite seen that happen, although I do assume that there must be quite a few, but they won't be as successful, shall we say, as they would have been in a better environment. So I can't answer that question now, and there tends to be delays in the announcements and those kind of exit discussions. But to their point, there's two things. Traditionally, family offices, institutional investors have always invested abroad. It was only through the FOMO effect of Kareem or through the hard work that the VCs were doing on educating on this asset class that people began to get interested. In fact, one thing that the Middle East has shown, and this was after having seen what was being done potentially in Africa and Turkey. The other day I did a webinar, Pakistan, which we're now covering. They have sovereign fund of funds. So the sovereign entities, so for instance in Abu Dhabi, the ADIO, Al-Waha in Bahrain, you have Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. They are trying to help fuel the ecosystem by investing not directly but through the fund of funds. That will further support the ecosystem. But to your point, they have specific mandates to invest here. So for many, what I find amusing is that the investors assume that the investors will invest in them. But at the same time, if they're going to invest in Southeast Asia, they'll need to speak to all the Southeast Asian investors, not just that one. And it's the same with the US. If you're going to choose to invest in the US, then you go and find who the best US investor. You can't really relate MENA region to, so if their mandate is to invest locally or the appetite of the family office or institution is to invest locally, it's not for a like comparison. And if they are looking to invest abroad, then they should speak to every VC that exists in Southeast Asia, and not just because they're comparing it to the local ecosystem. So I think that's not necessarily the right correlation.
Agreed.
And so that's a bit challenging.
Another big challenge that we're seeing in the region is talent. Every founder that we speak to, no matter how kind of, committed you are to establishing kind of your business locally in Riyadh, in Jeddah, in Cairo, Dubai still ranks high on talent, even if it's super expensive talent vis-a-vis the rest of the market. Where do we stand on, because being, committed to investing in Saudi companies is amazing to kind of develop that market, but there's also a huge gap in the talent that I'm not necessarily seeing any improvements on. I'm seeing, not to name names, I'm seeing Saudi companies during COVID building kind of remote, teams in Dubai. I'm seeing more and more of that. I'm seeing a lot of talent in Dubai losing their jobs for a variety of reasons, but still remaining and serving other startups in Saudi Arabia. What is kind of your view and what's Magnitt's role in kind of attracting or kind of tracking talent in the region?
So the first thing I have to say is that talent remains an issue because a startup is only as good as the talent they're able to get. Yeah. So that's the core issue. Yeah. The second thing is, it's not so much the talent. I think sometimes it's harsh to criticize the talent. It's the understanding and it's the mindset of what a startup requires over a corporate or a more traditional job that is the issue. Because you can find talented people, but if you can't find people that understand what it takes to work for a startup, then they can have all the talent that they want, but it's a different mindset. I do think it's beginning to change. I mean, take yourself as an example. Someone who's done multiple startups abroad, works for a company like Kareem, uses that huge amount of knowledge, is a perfect example of the results of successful employees of companies that have exited. And I think that the more exits that you see, the more talent will come in and kind of be able to educate the rest of the ecosystem. The second thing is that, for instance, one of the things I've always advocated for is before you go and start a company, join a startup. So the best way to learn what it takes to work for a startup is to kind of join them. The more people joining different startups, the more they have that they can share elsewhere. And then also, given the current environment, the opportunity cost is a lot lower now, given we've seen a little bit of correction in salaries. It is a difficult environment, and therefore I think the opportunity for talent remains there. Having said all of that, I think that without being overtly critical, the bureaucratic framework of how people employ talent in the UAE can be a hindrance to talent transfer. Because if you want the best talent, it's because they want to join your company, not because of a visa or a real estate and a license issue, etc., etc. So the free mobility of talent is a major issue here. Your Saudi point is the same example, though. It'll take time for companies to see this kind of evolution of talent. The Saudi ecosystem is really only about 3-4 years old in terms of development. So I think that, unfortunately, the one thing that we lack in the region is patience to a certain extent, because patience is a virtue. Many of these will be solved with time, but in the current environment, yes, it remains a pain point.
And I mean, one thing that Kareem did really, really well, besides being such a mission-driven organization that attracted talent, not just because of the success of the company, but because everyone bought into that mission, everyone really believed in that purpose-driven brand, etc. But one thing they did really, really well is, and as you said, is they had a very generous ESOP program, right? And they really took care of their own. And I mean, we can say that because it was a successful exit in the end, but I mean, we would say the opposite if it hadn't. But are we able to kind of understand whether startups are doing that across the board? Do we have that kind of transparency?
No, transparency is very difficult. I mean, the one thing I can say is that whenever you speak to, let's call it smart money that get investments in startups, the first thing that they'll tell you after your seed round is that you need to allocate a proportion of your cap table towards ESOP.
Yeah.
The challenge is the difficulty with actually issuing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not easy. As someone who's tried to structure ours with Magnitt, when you're going through international jurisdictions, lawyers, etc., it's costly and it's challenging with no guarantee of like the future growth of the company. It is not a simple instrument to implement. Now, there are tools of making it easier. I think if there was more ease of implementing, then it would be more widespread. So at a certain point, basically, if you've raised enough money and can pay for the legal hassle, people tend to implement it. But there's no transparency with how many companies are actually implementing that until exit. And even at exit, we don't know what the structure of cap tables are because they tend to be very private. Information asymmetry is a challenge. I mean, it's obviously what we've been built on, but the asymmetry is a challenge in the region.
Because I got to say, there's nothing more powerful than that, right?
Yeah.
For an organization to be able to attract talent. I mean, it's extremely cost effective in the short term for an organization, right? To be able to attract talent, retain them, motivate them with really good ESOP programs is the fundamental of being able to grow a team in a sustainable manner that you can afford. Right? I mean, yes, it's generous. Yes, it's super giving, and yes, it sets a good culture for an organization. But it's also very good from a cost perspective, right? And I just wonder if there's a way to correlate that to the success of an organization. But I guess time will tell, and we'll hear it in the cracks. There's a growing trend in the region of VCs now thinking that they want to become studios. They want to be part of the building. They want to be earlier stage. They want to get into the trenches. They want to be more founder friendly. Are we seeing, an increase in those types of funds?
I mean, I think that there has been an increased conversation around venture builders. And more people are getting into the earlier stage of supporting, whether it's through accelerator programs or programs for structuring. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily widespread. The majority of VCs who are entering the space are still potentially GP structures. I think where people have experience, or for whatever their own personal reasons are that they want to try and do something different, they have or we're hearing examples of that being
talking about
structured.
Amir.
Well, it's not
But
just
he's
Amir.
one great example.
There is others
Yeah.
that are doing it. I was speaking to a Saudi client of ours, and there's a strong belief that in Saudi Arabia, venture builders is one way of doing it. I mean, Enhance, the guys at Joy Gifts, is a good example of a venture builder. But they've always had that mandate from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think others that are experimenting, I mean, even WAMDA or the WAMDA Access program is to go earlier on in the exercise.
And arguably, Rocket Internet.
Yeah,
Right?
the Rocket Internet model.
When they first got into the region, that was probably the most successful model that we had.
For sure. But I don't believe that it's widespread yet, because
Okay.
I still think that the traditional model is still how VCs. What you are hearing a lot more of is how VCs are structuring themselves with more people that can support startups, entrepreneur in residences, founder-friendly management team.
A lot of the ex-Kareem executives are now joining those types of funds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So advisors. So that I can definitely vouch for. More venture builders, yes, but I'm not sure that the VCs themselves are necessarily switching as much versus maybe new ones just being created.
And have our current or previous accelerators been successful? Are we measuring their success rates?
So we are in the process of doing that for a potential client of ours that we're working with to track the success of the follow-on funds for all startups that have received investment. I don't have an answer for you today, but watch this space.
Okay, cool.
I think what's been interesting is to see more international players begin to emerge. Now, many of whom have relationships with governments that are supporting in bringing them. Flat Six Labs has been doing what they've been doing for several years. I think that accelerators play an extremely key role in supporting. I went through 500's growth dojo program. I found it game-changing even for ourselves. And I think that you really only know what you know, and that if you can learn from others, there's a huge amount that you can benefit from. But I think that we've yet to see the success of some of those in terms of kind of follow-on funding.
See, I haven't been a part of any of these accelerators, so I'm super naive to the topic. But beyond administrative support, beyond licensing, beyond a desk, beyond working with the free zones and all that stuff, what is the support system that you are getting as a startup today?
So there's an incubator that will help you with all the administrative stuff, which is funny because incubators traditionally, if you watch Silicon Valley, the show, and etc., it's a house whereby you can't get rent. You got a couple of other startups in there. Give us X and you can stay here for free, and we'll bring in a couple of interesting speakers or whatever it is. I mean, that's the incubator model. Here it is definitely to kind of handhold you with the bureaucracy of setting up and etc., mentors and kind of things, but it's not an accelerator program. An accelerator program tends to be a 3-month program structured with kind of people that come in for marketing and sales, and ultimately it's to get you to pitch at a demo day for a future investment round. And in the traditional accelerator model, you do this in exchange for cash and equity in your business. You effectively pay for the program and take an investment in exchange for equity in your business to the team that's basically providing you all of this guidance. The Y Combinators, the Techstars, plug and plays of this world. In that program, more often than not, they'll probably rip your business model apart, pick holes, advise you, guide you, and ultimately get you in the strongest position to be able to pitch to investors by the end of it, to potentially raise a seed round, because you're effectively doing it very early stage, and then you pitch at the end of it for a seed round of investment. So they have all their mentors and office hours to guide you. And the thing is, I mean, as someone who's done my MBA, did the MBA, as much as I was advised on all the lessons that I should avoid, I still did every one of those mistakes. And the truth is that you can only learn them when you do them yourself. So when you do the accelerator program, you're effectively doing what is like a mini MBA, but with your company as the case study that you're basically experimenting with.
So you found it effective?
Ours was a slightly later stage. It was a growth program, but we thought we literally were ripped apart in 2 months and put back together with a team of their mentors were all ex-founders.
Okay.
So they came with no ego. They just came with, we know what we're talking about. We've done this before. These are issues that you need to try and address. So yes, in my particular case, huge value.
And your business. Let's just pivot a little bit. Magnitt. You give us a bird's eye view and sometimes even some details of what's going on in the ecosystem. You track it, and when Walid was here, who I think MEVP is one of your backers or investors. One topic that I found interesting with him was this notion of overhype.
Yeah.
And arguably, you live in the business of hype, right? Or maybe I shouldn't say hype, but information. Sure. And we've been kind of harsh on ourselves, I think, over the last 6 months, and everyone's kind of been saying this, that we celebrate too many, but we don't kind of look at our reflection in the mirror more often than we should. And we don't really take an honest look at ourselves.
Yeah.
We're sitting here and we're saying, we're not as successful as we should be. We don't have enough investments. Deal flow is not where it should be. Successful exits are not where it should be. Before the pandemic, things were looking fantastic, but we're not even acknowledging our failures. And there have been many, and many go, unnoticed, and nobody ever speaks about it again. When it comes to, let's call them learnings, or instead of failures, learnings, what are we doing as an ecosystem, especially as Magnitt? What are you guys doing to kind of keep us up to speed in terms of having an honest look at ourselves? We always get the newsletter that says this guy got funded, but what are we doing, and what do you think your responsibility is on telling the other side of the story?
So Magnitt is a data platform. So many people think that we do media because of the newsletters, but at our core,
Sure.
we're
Data.
a data platform.
Yeah.
And for us, when it comes to our clients and the people that use us the most effectively, it's to access the data and the aggregated data
Sure.
on this information. So when we publish any of these news articles, what we focus on over the news itself is the information. So when you get our emails, you'll get the amount, the investor, the industry, competitors, previous funding, etc.
Sure.
We're not selling the news story, we're selling or sharing the information to the user. And that's very important to me, because ultimately it's not about just like the news and the hype, it's how can you disseminate this information. And one of the things that I think that we do have some responsibility for is providing that transparency. People will not know what the average ticket size is at the seed stage, or how much it should be at Series A. Well, if you begin to get information, if you identify that this company, at its core, why did Magnitt, I'm not going to say we're successful, but become a bit more notorious, is we localized a lot of that information to the region. TechCrunch, PitchBook, CBN, they make announcements, but if you can't relate to the startup, the investor, the amount, the story, it's not that relevant. So for us, it's very much core to our proposition is that transparency of data. The challenge is when it comes to failure, how do you quantify failure? Number one. Number two is, as much as we can support in providing that transparency, the onus is on the founder to come and share, or the team to come and share. We're not journalists at our core. We're not the Wall Street Journal. Our role is not to kind of unearth that. Our role is to try and get the information around the company that can help benchmark how X company did, how much funding did they receive, did they actually receive that funding or not, what was their evolution to the point at which they potentially had a failure. And that's the challenge, because ultimately it takes investigative journalism to really open up many of those issues. And number two, it requires a lot of transparency on behalf of the companies that are potentially failing. At one point, the most read article on Magnitt was it was a year ago, a guy who said that he burnt through $1 million of his tech headphone company.
Yeah, I remember that.
But it took somebody to tag him on LinkedIn tag me on his post on LinkedIn for me to reach out to him, for us to share it, to get that level of transparency. And I think that's part of the issue. Funding, people do herald their funding, and I'd be the first to say that there is a lot of funding announcements. But if we're just providing the information around that, then it's up to you to kind of work out the difference between one over the other. The failures, it's just a lot harder for people to be able to share.
No, understood. I just wondered, before you came in today, I went on your website and I couldn't help but read between the lines of the information, right? Like I would see funded startups, successful exits, But it just seemed overwhelmingly positive, which
Yeah.
I think is your role as well, to kind of encourage people to get into that space. I'm not saying otherwise. I'm just saying I'm wondering, do people honestly have the right perspective and the full perspective that they should kind of be aware of? And I agree with you. I don't think it's your responsibility. I just think I wonder.
So we do
Which
track
organization?
companies that are no longer active, should we
Yeah.
call it, right? So it's very hard to know. It's very hard to know if a company's failed. And
Yeah.
there's no the issue with the Middle East. There's no reporting requirements. There's no SEC. There's no
there's no
company
declaration,
house
there's
and
no-
etc.
yeah.
So when it comes to the venture space, a company could be shut down and just leave their website. So we find proxies, which we basically put together, and that's a big focus for us now as we're building out our data science, is like, how can we find the proxies that can indicate that information so that we can bring out the reporting. But in the absence of that, it's hearsay, and we're not in the business of hearsay. We're in the business of facts and numbers, and that's the challenge. When it comes to failure, a lot harder to track than
course,
information when companies are growing.
Of course. I want to go back to one of the points you made. You said there are less investments, but bigger investments, generally, as a general trend. And I was always of the kind of impression that when an industry has, a big, when a participant in an industry gets a big investment, a sizable investment, it dissuades others to get into that same industry, right? So I mean, if I wanted to start a marketplace, an e-commerce business today, and Noon raises another $1 billion, I'm probably not going to do that, right? And I think that kind of stands true when it comes to agri-tech and stuff like that. Like Pure Farms got, I don't know, 150 million.
Yeah.
Pure Harvest. I mean, if I had the same idea and all of a sudden, these guys raise $150 million, it kind of makes me a bit nervous about my play. Is it fair to assume that's going to happen this year? That less people are going to be encouraged to start their companies in those specific industries?
Well, to answer your first question, I think you're coming from such a low base of investments and amounts that you'll continue to see big rounds of investments. I mean, the maturity of the ecosystem is still
true.
Probably midway through a cycle of exit. That for these companies to grow, they're still going to require investment. And across all industries in MENA, cross geography, there's still enough opportunities for growth. Do I think that there's room for consolidation? Yes. Because one of the trends that you see is the opportunity in the opaqueness of the market, the bureaucratic and kind of regulatory burdens by geography means that you do see similar companies in Egypt, Saudi, Jordan, Oman, Bahrain, where actually, if brought together under one roof, could be a much more powerful proposition than each of them competing in their space. But that comes down to the entrepreneurial and survival instinct, and the survival of the fittest will be the one that is able to do that. And then you get acquired from an international player, as we've already seen, right? So that's just kind of the food chain. Should it dissuade people? Ultimately, as you know, it's as good as the implementation of the idea.
Sure.
And in some cases, just because they raised money, it doesn't mean that they're a strong, profitable startup. So to answer your question as to whether we'll see more people entering industries where people are invested, it's also a good signal that it's an interesting industry for investors.
Yeah,
so if somebody
it's a
does raise a
validation.
lot of money, it's a validation of an industry as well. So generically, it's hard to say. In specifics, you could talk about fintech. Every central bank in the region is opening up sandbox. It's not going to be completely uncommon that many similar companies are going to be created in Bahrain and the UAE and Abu Dhabi and Dubai and then Saudi, and then the one that will succeed in the long run will be the one that gets the right business model.
When you came in today, we were talking about the cost of operating a startup, and we were talking about office spaces and are they getting more affordable or not? And I think last week Dubai announced they had this freelancer visa.
Yeah.
What was it called?
Expat.
Yeah. And on the surface, it's fantastic. I mean, even for us as a business, we're always looking for those types of people that can come here, set up temporarily. We have a creative kind of department that would love that kind of setup. It still is overwhelmingly expensive. I mean, I don't know how you find it at Magnitt, but the visas, the offices, the insurances, the everything is extremely expensive. And I think these incubators and these accelerators do facilitate a lot of that. But I mean, it kind of feels like the only way you can really start a company over here is if you are wealthy, right? I mean, it's not common for a entrepreneur in the West to have, I don't know, not even $10,000 to start a company, right? Where are we on that front? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of PR of what we saw last week and things like that, but where are we really in terms of on the front of affordability?
I think, so if you look at it as a positive, if you went back 5 years compared to now, there are more options than ever before of where to locate, how, what options are available, etc. The second thing is, one thing that we never anticipated through Magnitt is the increased transparency of these opportunities also creates a competitive element to a certain extent of free zones and co-working spaces and etc. Is there a long way to go? Absolutely. But I think what's challenging now is that the high growth tech startups forms a small part of the economy. The wider economy is also struggling. The SME, the offline business. And to get all of that right is way above my pay scale. But I think that if there was ever a time now to try and address some of those issues, it makes sense that where people are more comfortable doing remote working, we discussed how our rent has come down. I mean, ultimately, I haven't been in my office for 7 months.
I'm only here because you're here.
literally. And so some of those things, look, I know that they're being discussed, thankfully, through the position that we have with Magnitt, but I think that is not as simple a solution, and I think it'll come, but it'll need some time to get there.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a challenge, right? I think, I know tons of people that are on the verge of starting their own businesses, and they were completely blindsided, and not generally only by the cost, but by the process. Yeah,
the process. Especially now, where you can't go in person.
I have friends who've been trying to open a bank account for a company for 7 months.
Yes.
And truth be told, the only reason we have a bank account, we had 2 different companies when we registered, was, and I hate to say this, and I'm not setting an example or advocating, but it's literally because I screamed at somebody. Right? So we only today have the capability to invoice and receive money and pay our bills because I had to literally scream at the top of my lungs, I think for 2 weeks straight, and going in person to that specific branch and
But you see the interesting thing there, so I have stories, but maybe for another day of how we did that, but it takes a certain character, and that's ultimately the Middle East, right? It takes certain characters that don't get defeatist when these things come up to overcome it, which is why you see some of these founders are serial entrepreneurs, ex-consultants, like their view and the hustle and the requirement to kind of overcome them. But it is not easy to do these things. Now, there are institutions. I mean, in Abu Dhabi, there's a huge effort to try and simplify these things. Here, Area 2071 and the guys at DFF are trying to. But is there a huge amount of improvement that can be done? Yes, but it'll take some time.
You know, on one side, I take that as a compliment, and I say, yes, I'm a good entrepreneur. I can overcome any challenge. But on the flip side to that, it kind of makes me sad, because when you think about kind of all the brilliant minds out there that might not have the personality or the character, or the tenacity in who they are to do those things, we don't attract those people here. We don't give them a platform to succeed. I wonder if the geeky little kid who can code anything wants to start a company.
So the first is that you need 3 co-founders, 2 co-founders. So it doesn't mean that guy can't find somebody else that can do it.
But what if he doesn't get along with anyone?
Well, that's
another problem.
It's really funny. I had a big investor from Silicon Valley that was visiting me, asked me to talk about the ecosystem, and then I was explaining these points: the license linked to the visas, real estate, etc., etc.
You need an office to open a bank account.
All of that. And then the one thing I did find quite surprising was when I was telling him about my real estate costs. I said, "Oh, it's really expensive." He goes, "That's not expensive." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "In Silicon Valley, that doesn't get you a bungalow anywhere."
Yeah. It's the most expensive place in the world.
But then I said, "But then you're not paying for everything else." So the free market there means that the one thing that people do compete on is rent. And that you just accept that if you want a nice office, you're going to have to pay up. But if you want to stay at home, you can stay at home and do whatever you have to do. The issue here is it's directly linked to your license. That's where the kind of difference is between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, overall, if the economics didn't make sense, we wouldn't be here.
No,
Right?
well, ultimately as well. Yeah.
So overall, from a business or even personal standpoint, if the economics still didn't make sense, I don't think Dubai would be Dubai. So I completely agree with that. But I think in order to let kind of the industry flourish and move a bit faster, I kind of think there's huge opportunity for improvements as we both agree.
And scale, because ultimately you need scale. You can have offices here, but to be your Kareem's, which I think was the leader in this space of 70, I can't remember how many countries they operated in, but it was the example that you cannot stay in one geography. It's got to be multiple geographies and not just MENA geographies, beyond MENA, to get to that level of scale. And I think that that's one of the things that is the biggest challenge, but the biggest opportunity for many founders, is that you cannot be thinking UAE only. It's got to be UAE plus plus plus.
Oh, absolutely.
And the same for many other geographies as well.
I mean, Kareem's tech heart was in Pakistan. I think at some point we even at that time opened another office in Berlin for engineers, and then at some point we had quite a bit of talent in Egypt, etc. So I completely take to that point, but before that stage, right?
Yeah,
I think before you have the resources and capabilities and even the vision to grow to that scale, absolutely.
And just to that point, I think it's the one thing that I hope COVID doesn't impact. The investment and the momentum in the ecosystem, I'm not saying was exponential, but you began to see some real positive signs.
Yeah.
I just hope that hasn't been retarded by a couple of years because of what's happened, and that we can still continue to see that acceleration across the region.
But it kind of feels like it is going to be, though. It already feels that way. It feels like we're on a little bit of a pause or a slow-mo. I think it's kind of expected too. I think everybody that I know is on a personal, not just corporate basis, is taking their time in their decisions. If you were gonna buy a house, you're taking your time. If your car needed replacing, you're waiting to see what's gonna happen in the world. So I mean, today our car broke down, and I told my wife I'm not replacing the car.
Wait.
We're just gonna wait, right? So it's inevitable. Like this instability or this uncertainty of the future is gonna affect everybody. I just I just hope, like you said, the ripple effect isn't too harsh. There's lots of data in your head that I'm unaware of. You serve many different types of customers. Generally, I'd love to kind of understand what you are seeing that we're not seeing. What are the data points, the top 3 things that we need to know about, that we don't know about? I'm really curious to get your perspective. If there was, 3 things that, absolutely, positively impacted you in the last couple of months, what are those data points, if you could share any?
So selfishly, we're expanding beyond MENA because I think we've begun to see more interest from international players in the region and the cross-pollination that can potentially exist when you break down the barriers of information.
Sure.
So we've now begun to cover Pakistan and Turkey. We've hosted 2 webinars. And one of the things that's been quite fascinating is that at the moment in each of those markets, they're very isolated and self-siloed. They grow within that market, very similar to Egypt or Saudi,
Sure.
etc. And when you can break down the transparency of the barriers between them, you realize that there's more cross-pollination that can potentially exist through that information availability. And we're seeing that in Southeast Asia and Africa, which is where we want to try and continue to go to next. And the reason I say that is because we have received specific interest from entities that are interested in the region, but don't know much about it and need support in getting
What sort
there.
of entities?
Government entities,
Okay.
investors, large startups looking for potential acquisitions or companies in this space that they want to kind of understand the landscape. And I think that that's something at a whole that is quite interesting.
And that's different from a few years ago.
For sure, yeah.
Okay.
Different from a few years ago.
Okay.
Even there's benefits for many of them to begin to start set up here. I mean, I think that the work that's being done, for instance, in Saudi Arabia right now, again, coming from a relatively low base, is really focused at multiple entities. There's about 3-4 different government entities focused on opening up the kingdom, attracting international investors in the same way as they have done here in the UAE. And I think that's extremely beneficial. I think that from a regional perspective, what's interesting is that Egypt is a fertile market for early stage startups to begin, but then needing to scale out. I think Saudi will continue to grow at strong rate.
Yep.
I think the UAE will still position itself as a strong leader in this space because of the talent that you mentioned. But I do think that you're going to see a shift away. The difficulties with COVID, actually, fintech had overtaken e-commerce as the most invested industry. E-commerce has come back to overtake fintech again, right? And even the UAE has now gone back and overtaken Egypt as the country which has received the most investment by number of deals. Yeah. So some of those historical norms have shifted back during the current environment.
And why is that?
I think because e-commerce during this pandemic has just seen such huge increased demand that investors...
And just because those organizations are predominantly here.
Correct. Okay. I think the second thing that you'll begin to see is more international players investing in this region, as I was alluding to. So the mix local international is about 70-30, but the absolute number of investors that are investing in the region continues to grow. So I think you are going to see more and more international players come into this market. And I think the final one has to be around exits. I think there'll be a pause, but we'll see an acceleration of exits into 2021 as you see consolidation of the market, where companies that may have not been as successful in this environment or different geographies being brought together, consolidating, as well as international opportunities for acquisition, as we've already seen historically, continue into 2021.
Super interesting. We've been talking for about 50 minutes. I'm kind of naive to kind of the variety of work that you guys do. I think I've seen the bird's eye view kind of freemium products that you have. Forgive my cheapness. But if you're serving potential investors, large organizations, M&A opportunities, et cetera, if you dissect your clientele, where does most of your business, who do you serve the most today?
So before I jump into who the clients are, the thing that some people, again, that's why we're very focused on data. We've got three main products that we sell. One is the access to the data, analytics, charts. You can actually go on the platform and create all of your own charts in a model-based approach. So that's one. The second is, as we continue to develop our newsletter and the platform and the popularity of the platform, people know Magnitt as a hub. So they come to advertise specific things through Magnitt, whether it's conferences, events, accelerator programs, people that want to try and raise visibility about what it is that they're doing in this space. And the third, because we have this data, is research. So we do either white label research, third-party research, or our own research that becomes available for clients in this space by industry, by geography, and by trends. Clients are actually quite varied when you then split it up. I think it was Anand from CB Insights who says that he believes he's only serviced 1% of the institutional corporate environment in the US, because all of them could be potentially interested in tech. And I think in the region, governments are really trying to continue to work out what their policies are to supporting startups and innovation, and really need to understand what's happening in this space. Corporates that before the crisis were really trying to drive corporate innovation programs. Those that want to identify startups, who they should be tackling, speaking to, how they can support them. Because ultimately, when you see the likes of these big exits, if you can get involved a lot earlier on, they're prime acquisition targets or supporters of your products. Consultancy firms that then have multiple clients that they can go out and service as well. And then from the marketing perspective, big tech who have products that they continue to want to support, conferences and accelerator programs, and service providers. So across the board, and the one that I didn't tell you is investors, because investors use the platform, aren't necessarily always customers. The more intrigued investors will be keen on better understanding, whether it's by industry, by sector, and as we continue to open up by geography to get that information. And actually we get a strong pipeline of investors from outside of the region who are looking to learn more about the region. So that's kind of the breakup of who it is that we're speaking to on a day-to-day basis.
You know, I find what you do admirable because, not just because you're a guest, but because we live in the consumer world, and access to information and data on a consumer level in the region is extremely poor. Even the players that supposedly give you access to that data are extremely poor in the quality of their services and the breadth of their services. In the West and in Canada especially, there's a wealth of super affordable kind of data tools for startups, be it through platforms like Google that allow you to survey anybody, anytime, almost immediately. Anyway, there's a bunch of self-service tools that more established and kind of mature markets have. To hear about the wealth of knowledge and data that you can give investors and organizations about the ecosystem is incredible. I just wish that we had something comparable on a consumer level. I think one of the biggest problems that startups have over here in their preparation to launching is understanding who their customers are or who they might be, and the user habits that they hold. And I have to say, every single customer that we have today at DUCKLIFE, for example, we're also an advisory. Nobody has a single clue who their customers are or who they want to serve. Why is that in your kind of understanding of our market? It's not really what you do, but why don't we have that
related to our market, if there's no reporting requirements to be able to share that information, then it becomes very difficult to acquire it. Ultimately, Zawiya is the role model example of what it is that we're doing, which was acquired by Thomson Reuters, right? And when you look at that space, the Zawiya space, Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, multiple examples of platforms that exist abroad, many of which are plugged into reporting and regulatory and bureaucratic bureaus that gather this information. That isn't the case here. If you wanted to get company information, you need to plug into 20 free zones, and then you wouldn't be able to get the information, whether it's for consumers or company or related. One of the things, like for instance in startups, is that we're not tagged as a different entity. So a high growth tech company isn't tagged any differently than an SME business. Whereas if you go to the UK, for instance, you can go to the company house, and for the advantages that you get for income tax, you can ask for SCIS or EIS regulation or sign up when you're registering your company, which means that in the database mechanism of tracking success, cap tables, changes in ownership, etc., you can filter for that. That doesn't exist yet. And I can only assume that from a consumer behavior perspective, there's many similarities in that. And you probably defect to the larger players in that industry. If you went to telecoms, you'd need to go to the telecom players. If you go into the media, it's not like the institutions themselves won't have this information. It's just not publicly available.
It's incredible. We have a client, for example, that was asking me and asking for our help getting basic macro information. How many restaurants are there in Saudi Arabia?
Yep.
Impossible to know.
That's why you pay McKinsey. That's why you pay McKinsey what you pay.
Yeah, it's incredible. I guess we should just charge more money and do it ourselves.
But it is that.
But it is a fundamental crack in the system.
But herein lies the opportunity, right? In the absence of this information, that's why there is a huge value for it. And it's and again, the data is only as good as the analysis or the understanding of what that data is.
Sure.
You can have data, but somebody needs to then use it to be able to do something. And I think that's where there genuinely is an opportunity there.
Absolutely.
But again, it's because of that there's high barriers to gathering that information.
Absolutely. Final question, and I'll let you go. You're in the business of data for most clients who want to predict something.
Yeah.
What are your predictions for 2021?
Great question. Honestly, I think if governments can continue to support the startup ecosystem as it is, we will cross the $1 billion mark, which I actually think we might pass this year. Okay. Where we've actually, as of today in October, matched the total amount of investment of last year. So my prediction at the beginning of the year was to reach over $1 billion. I think that next year, if we continue to see, or we see benefit, like the pandemic begin to reside, that we should continue to see growth in terms of funding beyond $1 billion worth of funding. I think that we'll continue to see growth in Saudi Arabia in terms of investment and the number of startups.
Sure.
I don't know that we'll see another unicorn exit for potentially 1 or 2 years. So that's a prediction in the opposite example.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more international, Southeast Asian, US, European VCs establishing in the region to take opportunities of the arbitrage that you see with regards to funding. Not all quantified data predictions. I haven't thought of the question enough beforehand.
Well, most of the
but I
time
think
you have a bunch of data work in the back of your hand, back of your head, and it generates a feeling. So that's
those
that's
are some of the subjective things. Honestly, this year has been mind-boggling to get your head around, like as it is for everyone.
Yeah.
But especially in this place, what I think I've been most impressed with is the resilience of many startup founders. Again, we go back to March, April, there was widespread panic.
Yeah.
I think April, May, many companies took very difficult decisions to optimize for cash flow, to optimize for their companies. I think that when you speak to investors, they'll tell you the ones that manage their cash flow, maintain their company and growth, and were able to define new products to find opportunistic products out of this situation, will be the ones that come out stronger at the end of it. And I think that will be the story for 2021.
I look forward to it. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Really appreciate having you.
My pleasure.
Here.
Thank you.
That was another episode of Duck It with Philip from Magnitt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.